Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Morata.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Stuart Scheller, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
And I love that you're coming on the show. I definitely can empathize with you, where you've been, what you've done to get here. I am hypercritical of the modern state of the military, how we conducted ourselves in the combat zones. When I saw Secretary Austin, who, look, I don't hold him in low regard or high regard, but I'm suspect of him because I was in Iraq and I watched him and Joe Biden and all of the same dudes botch not only the Arab Spring, but also the withdrawal from Iraq. And they did it ham-handedly. They didn't handle it. And then, like, we're supposed to expect them to do a good job in Afghanistan. I just don't think so. So when I see the Secretary of Defense say, I don't know how many Americans are in Afghanistan, and I can't guarantee their safety, I'm wondering, where's the resignation letter? Where do you, how do you, and then the other day you wrote about this and Joe Biden's remarks. And again, I have no respect for this man in terms of foreign policy. I appreciate that he's president. I appreciate that's a hard job. I wouldn't want that job. But when you're not going to apologize for a national disgrace that not only is an embarrassment internally, but we also let our other allies down, France, fill in the blank, all these countries that agreed to go out there with us and help to restabilize and rebuild Afghanistan, and we just peace out on these guys, and they're like, hey, what about our people that are trapped there? That is that's not only unset, that's criminal in my mind.
I agree.
Interview over.
Yeah, everything you just said. The Secretary of Defense, he has done so many things wrong. We're not even really talking about him because he's just such a non-player in terms of asserting himself as a leader. General McKenzie's actually the one that got on after the withdrawal or evacuation, is what it quickly turned into, was complete. And he, by his own admission, said we left hundreds of Americans, that hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment. And we found out later it was thousands of Americans, but he justified it by saying it wasn't a DOD mission anymore. It was a Department of State mission. But then Secretary Blinken got in front of Congress 2 weeks later and said, I didn't inherit a plan and I was not prepared for this. And so it's like, at every turn, this thing was just completely wrong. It's probably one of the best examples over the last century of just incompetent leadership, no one taking accountability, and a poor plan from beginning to end.
You join a long list of people that have blown the whistle, whether it's on these wars or in other ways. And the list is a motley crew, and not everybody agrees with everybody, but Matt Ho, who I think everybody should go watch your episode with Jocko. You guys cover all the basics of your career, and there's so much detail, and then it's like almost 4 hours long. So everybody should go watch that. We're not talking about any of that stuff. We're gonna get into different aspects of this because Jocko did that work with you already. He mentions Matt Ho in that one, but also Edward Snowden, PFC Manning, Peter Van Buren, who wrote a whole book about We Meant Well from the State Department point of view, and the State Department tried to axe his career. Erik Kleinsmith, who found the 9/11 bombers before 9/11, and that we weren't able, because of legal restrictions and everything else, to actually have that information. So all these things have happened over and over again. I'm not equating you to PFC Manning or Peter Van Buren or anything.
Because I was actually about to correct you. If there's one person I don't want to be compared to, it's PFC Manning.
Well, he is a whistleblower, right? He does point out part of the problem. And the thing is Peter and I worked in the same unit as PFC Manning. Now, I didn't know PFC Manning. But if you're in a brigade talk, you're 25 feet from the dude at any given point, and when he writes those notes or releases those notes, and I'm not trying to justify anything they did, he wasn't wrong. I'm saying he because at the time he was he wasn't wrong. The State Department was misstepping. I'm hypercritical of the State Department and their failures. So there's a long line of people. Edward Snowden, we can be mad at him for releasing secrets, but he also was right. Like, the U.S. government was illegally listening to our stuff.
I'm pro Edward Snowden. I think Edward Snowden said some things that probably needed to be said, and I don't think people fully appreciated some of the things that he released. But Manning, in my opinion, just that one's a different situation. A whistleblower to an extent.
Yeah.
But I think probably did more harm than good.
I think that's fair. I also think the State Department did more harm than he did.
Yeah, that's also true.
By their behavior. So, and we're not here to talk about that, but this is a weird group of people that are struggling with their conscience. Like, how do I sit in this organization and continue to push this false narrative, see these lies, watch our misbehavior? And then you're all struck. Even Alex Vindeman, same thing. Alex Vindeman may have hated Donald Trump going in and may have been waiting for the moment when he heard something that he thought was illegal. And Alex has been on this show, but he said, hey, I'm going to put my oak leaf cluster on the table and say, this is wrong. And, he stood up and did what he thought was right. So when you're going through this calculus, and I know you've talked a lot about this part of it, you called the shots, you called the path, you knew that you would be sold out by your friends, and you knew that they would, do all these actions. Did you underestimate the impact on what's happened, and how long do you think it will be heavy, or is it still heavy, the weight that you have to bear in terms of that decision when you put that video out in August?
Yeah, I'll say the difference between that list of characters that you just described, Snowden and Manning were both very junior and lacked a lot of experience. And Vindeman walked away with his retirement without really much punishment.
Right.
I am one of the only people that has maybe more experience than some of our senior leaders in terms of our last two wars. I was very, distinguished senior, had a lot of experiences in education, and I left my retirement and everything on the table. And I didn't seek whistleblower protection. I just said very true things and wasn't afraid to back down despite all the personal and professional attacks. And so, I believed in what I said. I still stand by it, and I still plan on moving forward, and we'll let the chips fall where they fall.
One of the things I will say about Alex Vindeman is I didn't allow him to play victim, because you and I both know, like, hey, you're retiring as an 05.
Yeah.
I promise you're going to be fine. It's not comfortable. What ultimately happened was he lost a gig that he was highly trained for, but you don't get to work for the boss. Yeah. If you testify against the boss, you lose that job. So he's not that much of a victim. You definitely have a different price to pay. Do you think that there is down the road a reinstatement of a retirement for you, or do you think that ship has sailed?
I'm not planning on it.
Okay.
I plan on ending up on top in other ways, but I think the divide between me and the military is pretty wide right now. And so I'm not even looking back. I'm trying to just look forward, and, trying to reconcile a retirement through some type of appeals process is, I think, energy that could be spent elsewhere. When I picture you, and believe me, I get white hot about this stuff. So I absolutely understand the position you come from. And when those service members were killed because of Joe Biden's irresponsible, dumb decision, that is part of the cost of service, right? But I picture you as a good Marine with your Mattis reading list, going through your meditations of Marcus Aurelius and deciding, like if I tell the truth, I cannot be harmed, right? Because you're being the person that you are. How much of a stoic are you? I've read meditations. I'm pretty well read, but even though I said true things, I did it in a manner that, everyone in the military can't just say whatever they want, whenever they want. I weighed the cost against the potential impact that I could have, and I made a decision. Yeah. You had a career full of energy. I mean, I speak commander at a pretty high level. I've worked with a lot of you guys, and you were going places. I mean, I would say at a minimum, we were looking at getting at least a star. And once you become a general, it's almost like a whole new game. Any regrets on that, on giving that up? There's two camps of thinking. There's, you got to make change within the system, and to do it, you got to keep playing the game. But I got to a point where I came to the conclusion that continuing to play the game and staying quiet, you give up too much of yourself. And by the time you get to the place where you think you can make change, unknowingly, you become the system that you're trying to fix. And right. So I know that we can't bring back the lives of the service members that we lost or the catastrophe that took place in Afghanistan. But I do believe that we can get ahead and make changes to prevent something like that from happening again. And ultimately, I think I had to break free from the military to make the changes that need to be made.
in your session with Jocko, he talks about how, like, when he came up, he was a bit of a rebel, and that's sort of what that led him to being a SEAL. And he didn't peg you on that, which I think is correct. But what I think he missed about you is that you're a man of deep principles. And I don't want to give you the stain of Robert E. Lee, but Robert E. Lee ends up being Robert E. Lee in part because he was this maybe the best officer in the military, and he was a man of uncompromising character to a fault, right? And I think that's more of where you're at. And I'm not saying it's a fault, but you're definitely a man of destiny, and you can't reject your destiny, whether you're Colin Kaepernick or Lewis and Clark. Like, this is your moment. There is no avoiding it. But does this define you going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Robert E. Lee, it's a really interesting example. You know, the North wanted him to, and he felt his home was in Virginia. Robert E. Lee, very influenced by Napoleon. And quite honestly, a lot of people think Robert E. Lee was the greatest general of the South. But my personal opinion is that his attempt to fight conventionally and win a battle in the North ultimately is what lost it for him. I think if he'd have been more distributed and just exercised more patience, he probably would have been more successful. But that's, hindsight's always 20/20.
Yeah.
As far as his principles, though, I completely agree with you. And also something a lot of people don't know about Robert E. Lee is after the war, like, he could hardly talk about it, right? He was just kind of devastated. He was over the military, and, he had been through a lot. And so I can sympathize with his pain after all of his sacrifices and everything that he did on principles about how the rest of his life kind of played out. Will this moment define me? I don't know. I will say, in terms of my principles, I love America, and I disagree with all the people that told me that this is how the system is and you can't make changes. I philosophically disagree. I think the power of the government comes from the people. And when I see things that fundamentally need to be changed, and as I already stated, I felt like I got to a point where continuing to play within the rules of the system was maybe not in the best interest of making the changes that need to happen, I started making choices. And yes, I do think I'm on a path, and I'm going to have the strength and courage to continue to walk down that path, but I don't know where it ends.
Yeah, well, God bless for doing that. I know it's not simple. I know it's not easy. It's one of the hardest things. But when we scope back and we look at our approach to conflict the last 20 years, if we're not prepared to change everything, we're wrong. We lost, and we lost in large part because we didn't give a damn to give a damn. We don't hold any. How can nobody be accountable? I know General Bolger has said, hey, as a general officer, we screwed up, right? But he's a short list of people, and there are some guys that signed some declarations, that kind of thing. But the culpability, the responsibility, you went to jail. and so, like, when I think about a thing like Abu Ghraib, and how many service members did Abu Ghraib kill? Where we did that, and nobody above lieutenant colonel had any repercussion whatsoever. And even that lieutenant colonel really wasn't punished. But we did put some PFCs in jail. That was telling to me, when you have this massive mistake, and clearly, look, criminality is criminality. PFCs shouldn't be doing things that are illegal. However, where is the immediate thing to the commander going, how are these people deployed? Oh, well, the training was crap. Oh, okay, great. Well, good enough. Everybody go home, put those PFCs in jail. That's bullshit.
100%. And that's a great example. Abu Ghraib is a moral courage case study in our current wars. But if you go back to Vietnam, My Lai is another moral courage case study that everyone focuses on. And the same thing, company grade officers were held accountable, but there was no senior generals that were held accountable. And that is criminal, in my opinion. And I'll also, you talked about the failing wars over the last 20 years. A lot of the problem with the failing wars is that we tried to fight limited wars in a sense. There was rules. So use Afghanistan for an example. We knew where the enemy was staging and basing in Pakistan, but we were unable to go and fight them. And you brought up the example with Lincoln earlier. Lincoln was the same way when he started the Civil War against the South with Lee, but he soon came to the conclusion that he had to go into total war because he had to win the war to be able to unify it. And so after about a year, it was like all bets were off. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to win the war. At no point in our global war on terrorism did our politicians get to a point where it was, we have to do whatever it takes to win the war. It was, we're just going to stay within the confines of the nation building, within the borders of the country that we invaded, and we're not willing to do anything else. Therefore, we're comfortable after 10 years of just kind of pulling out. So Biden's speech deeply troubled me because it was like he stated the Taliban has been the killer of empires and there's just no way to beat them. There was absolutely ways to beat them. We just chose not to do what it took.
Yeah. You and I both have been across Afghanistan. I know you stood on the mountains and looked into Pakistan and seen that you talked about this again on the Jocko episode. And I've watched us do the same thing in Iraq with Iranian influence. Like, here is this Iranian influence. Why don't we do something about this? The Iraqis were, so I would go out every day and I would talk to the Iraqis and be like, talk to me about Iranian influence. And they're like, it influences our farm market prices. It influences here. These are Shia complaining about Iranians, right? So Shia, this wasn't it. This is how dumb we are, Stuart. We think it's actually sectarian violence. It's political violence. This is, yes, the groups are divided along, but they don't care whose Jesus is what and Muhammad and Ali, and they don't care about that. These are Iraqis. What they cared about was getting Iran out of their business. Now, who did care about Iraq was Iran and Saudi Arabia. They want to destabilize Iraq. They want to take pieces of that. We never dealt with that. We never dealt with that on theoretic all the way down to ground truth level. We never comprehended that, and people right now are rejecting the fact that I'm saying that this was not a religious fight.
Yeah, to kind of reinforce what you just said, the Shia and Sunni was absolutely a factor. So I don't want to say it was not relevant, because it was. That being said, if you asked someone that lived in Iraq what they related with, thinking they may say Shia or Sunni, they all said Iraqi. They had a national identity and they believed in their national identity. The one exception might be the Kurds, but even the Kurds, I think, would still answer that question as Iraqi. And so they had a national identity. And to your point, they just had a lot of destabilization from foreign actors that we weren't prepared to address.
I'm getting mad. Quite honestly, I'm getting mad. I know you look at this as a problem of an operational strategic level. I'm going to challenge you on this and say there is no level that doesn't have a significant problem. And I'm an Army guy, so I'm going to point my finger at the major commands, Force Com, TRADOC especially. Here's the thing that I got to do, Stuart, is I got to stay in an area for a long time and do the same job over and over and over again, right? I'm just collecting information, and I got really good at it because I was constantly doing it. I was networking in, and I knew people. And I could go up to a guy like you as a commander and say, hey, listen, your past commanders have told me to be audacious. So I'm going to tell you that I'm going to give you the future. Here's in 3 weeks, this is going to happen. And in 3 months, this is going to happen. And then it always came true because I'd done the job a whole lot. What I noticed was that every unit they came in was ill prepared for the fight at hand. We have fetishized lethality. I'm not saying that Marines shouldn't be lethal, right? There's a time and place for that. But our capability to do the rest of the job, to balance the workout, was never there. No unit ever came prepared, not institutionally. Maybe a person had read the right books. Maybe a person had been before and had some inkling, but we didn't redeploy back to the same areas. And so we didn't handle this thing. The boots on the ground were as unprepared as the generals were prepared to prepare them.
Yeah, no doubt there was many tactical failures. My point is that's all we focused on was the tactical failures, and no one is addressing the operational and strategic failures, which in my opinion are more important. I think you can throw an untrained unit into an AO, or maybe not untrained, but unprepared to the extent that you're describing, and they're going to figure it out after a couple months. Doesn't mean those mistakes don't have impacts, but they're going to figure it out. But you can't have the operational and strategic level have mistakes and throw people into the tactical level and have them still win the war. You have to get the top macro level correct, and we just never did.
Yeah, and I agree with you on this. The top macro level, and again, I'm going all the way up to the theoretic level. The academics that are advising had no possible clue how detached they were from the ground. I always called it like, here's the ground truth, and then they're in the spaceship, and they're looking down at Earth, and they're thinking that they can direct things, but there was never any link between the very, very basic tactical skills required and nudging that towards the strategic win. It just didn't exist. So when you look at operationally, who do we hang that on?
Who do we hold accountable, or what do we do?
Yeah, who do we hold accountable for the strategic stuff? Sure. Okay. SecDef and people with more than 2 stars on their collar, but okay, great. But what about this operational level? Look, as well as I do, if you wanted to put a bunch of Chinooks and a company worth of Marines somewhere outside of within, let's say 2 miles of your guys' hooches, it took RC level planning, and you're like, thanks for the approval 3 weeks from now when the opportunity is gone.
I would start with General McKenzie, the combatant commander that was in charge of the Afghanistan withdrawal, that should have advised the National Security Council better. But I mean, you can hold the Secretary of Defense just as accountable. I think the Secretary of Defense and I think General McKenzie, I'd start with General McKenzie, because quite honestly, we need some military generals to start being held accountable. What that'll do is it'll force other generals that are just focused on their career to look over their shoulders and think, hey, winning wars might also be important. So if I was the president, I would hold General McKenzie accountable. Even as a lieutenant colonel, I'm doing everything I can to bring awareness to how he should be held accountable. But to your point, I mean, you could go back the last 20 years and start looking at all these failures. But you got to start somewhere. There's a current guy that's still sitting there, that's still in charge, that just had one of the worst plans executed at a very unacceptable cost, that we could still hold accountable if people found their voice.
We all have bad bosses, and I'm going to call Joe Biden a bad boss. When you approach your bad boss and you give him your multiple COA, briefing, and he's like, well, what do you recommend? And you recommend COA 2, course of action for everybody listening. And he's like, I think I'll go with COA 4, whatever it is.
Said every boss ever.
Exactly. What do? All right. So you're General Scheller. There's Stu in there. And he's like, well, sir, option 4. And then what do you say?
Well, so this has happened in history before. So if you go back and look at Carter and Korea, there was a General Singlaub that Carter was trying to pull all the forces out of Korea. And this guy was saying, if you do that, there's going to be a war that's going to break out in Korea. And he told him that privately. He offered the COAs, and Carter said, no, I want to pull everybody out. It's like the same situation. But Singlaub back then had the courage to then go public and say Carter's going to get everybody killed and he's going to start a war, and ultimately had an impact by doing that. General McKenzie and the generals of today have just kind of lost the courage and the foresight to do that. And so when you're a staff officer, which all of us at this level have been staff officers, there's an art to convincing your boss on how to take the plan. But sometimes you just can't do that. And when you can't do that, you have to be able to put pressure back on your boss in some type of ways. Like, I agree with Singlaub and the approach that he took. But even if General McKenzie couldn't convince him and then decided, I'm not going to go public, I'm going to assume the restraints of the plan, I think there's still much better ways that he could have executed it on the tactical level. But, hindsight's always 20/20. But at a very bare minimum, when it failed, which I don't see how anyone else can argue that it wasn't a failure, he should raise his hand and say, I'm held accountable because I accepted the restraints imposed upon me. I wasn't able to get the boss to convince another plan, so therefore I am accountable.
When you give that boss that recommendation and they go the other way, you do have a career crisis at that point, at the level that McKinsey's playing at. And you do have to decide, and again, you and Jocko talk about this, am I more valuable in this organization or out? Yeah. And then when it goes south and it does not work well, at some point, I would never get there because I'm not a political animal, but I would, honestly, if I gave my recommendation to a guy and like these are other options you can take, and he takes one that I know to be wrong, I can't stay in the room. You can't, if you don't trust me enough to take my expert opinion based upon decades in this field, I don't know. I mean, I hope I would have the courage to just walk away and say, I'm not the guy to do this and then leave. But do we not demand that of our generals these days?
Apparently not.
What about, okay, so we've had a lot of chiefs of staff. We've had a lot of secretaries of the Navy, Army, and all these kind of things. And a lot of them have been military people. One of my pet peeves is that, and I'm not going to do the work to look it up, but I know more than 5 generals have said, we've turned the corner in Afghanistan. Well, apparently we didn't. McChrystal didn't do it. And as much as everybody likes General Mattis, he didn't do it. No. On and on and on.
Well, So when they say they turn the corner, again, they're confusing tactical success with operational and strategic success. It's the same thing happened in Iraq. Remember when they did a Iraqi council and they advised President Bush to pull troops out, and he doubled down and had the surge. And the surge in Iraq did have a tactical impact. It did it influenced the population and brought the significant events down and bought more space and time. But just because you're having tactical success doesn't mean that it's going to equate to the operational and strategic goals that you've set for the theater or the war if those assumptions are fundamentally flawed. So I think when those generals said that, they were focused on the tactical level and they just failed to comprehend what was needed to happen at the operational and strategic levels. Because you can go into Afghanistan and turn a corner and build a great, Afghanistan republic, the government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. They call it JIROA. They're focused on that. They're focused on the significant events, but they weren't focused on how big the logistical hub was in Pakistan, right? They weren't focused on, does the things that we're giving them, building them wells and building them schools and infrastructure, is that sustainable through their eyes? Like these basic things that are pretty easy to see when you're over there, it just were never addressed effectively.
One of the things that drives me a little bit crazy is when we talk about these tactical wins, and as a guy that's on the ground trying to give the ground truth out, I can't find them. One of the things I like to ask commanders, so I'll ask you as a commander, when was the last time, look, line item number 1 in your mission statement, close with and destroy the enemy. When was the last time a battalion commander or above closed with and destroyed an enemy? We obviously don't get swords and flags these days, and I'm not talking go on an operation and kill 3 bad guys. I'm talking you severely inhibit the manpower by destroying the enemy. When was the last time that happened? I know it happened in Iraq early on, but when did it actually happen last?
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of that. I know you brought up Iraq. Fallujah, that's a great example of battalions going through, closing with, and destroying the enemy. Even in Afghanistan, there was a 2nd Recon Battalion. There's a couple battalions that did some pushes through Southwest that closed with and destroyed hundreds of enemy. So it did happen. But the problem was in those examples, even though you did it, you weren't able to tie it to the overall goals.
And it didn't happen often enough. And here's what the Taliban figured out. We're just going to not engage you at that level.
Yeah. So Marja is a great example of that. We did a huge multiple battalion clearing operation in Marja that was like live broadcasted, and they did it very easily because the Taliban just thought, okay, we know you're going to do this huge clearing operation. We're just going to go back over to Pakistan. We're going to let you sit there for 6 months, and then we're going to slowly come back and pick you apart. So yes, they got wise to that.
You talked about building wells and schools and all these things. Every commander I worked with had the same basic question. Hey, how many schools are in my area? And they would ask me like I was supposed to know. And I'm like, hey, man, why don't you ask the guys who built the schools who were here before? We had this unit, this organizational amnesia. You had no idea what the unit before you did. And you didn't even know the unit 2 units before if they even existed. There was, I hear these stories all the time, and I'm sure you've got them too, where like we came in and we built a governance center 3 times in the same district, 3 of them. They're like, there's the red one, there's the pink one, and there's the blue one. This kind of insanity, even if you can go kill 100 bad guys, we're getting our asses kicked in every other way.
100%. I was in Ramadi doing census patrols where you knock on the door, ask who lives there, and get demographics. And I talked to a guy when I got back, and he's like, we did the exact same thing 2 years ago, right? So it's like, how many units go over there and just restart the same process? But, it's just different than World War II, where you're pushing through, clearing, and you're not doing census patrols. I quite honestly am just not a believer in counterinsurgency. I think the way you fight an insurgency is not to engage it. There may be times where you have to dust off the small wars journal and figure out how to complete these tactics, but it should be for a very limited amount of time. Ultimately, the military isn't designed or equipped based on all the restraints of deployments and the things you're talking about now to fight for multiple decades trying to build some type of governance. It's designed to go in there, close with, and destroy the enemy. And once you do that, there needs to be more critical thought on what comes next.
But we are designed to hold space, right? Clear, build, hold. Here's a problem theoretically. Clear, build, hold. Well, then what? right? And we never built the next part of it, the then what part. Like how one of the great questions I was asked by a farmer in Iraq and also a guy in Afghanistan was, hey, how long would your government work with no electricity? I'm like, about 8 minutes. And then we'd lose our damn minds. And he's like, yeah, well, we've already lost our minds here, right? So these are basic principles that the Army or the military absolutely can help, right? We can't build at high tension. One farmer in Iraq said, I can light the dirt in my backyard on fire. There's so much oil in it. And you guys didn't think to build a high tension power grid and just charge us for it later on, but we didn't. So we have all these problems, and it all of a sudden becomes impossible to win, even if you can go to Pakistan and kill guys, because, and Joe Biden, this is where Joe Biden gets things wrong. He talks about you can't unify Afghanistan, but he also preaches diversity, which is really the antonym of unity, right? So at some point, you have to find some things that unite people, and electricity, I promise, it unites people.
The Joe Biden's comments, I mean, they're just so outlandish. He brought up the fiscal cost of the Afghanistan war and credited that to be the driving force of why he got out. But then what he didn't mention is he's given like $700 billion, something like that, $70 billion. Somebody check the facts. Multiple billions of dollars to the Afghan government to help the suffering of the people now that the Taliban have taken over. My follow-up question is like, where's that money going? If you're giving it to the government of Afghanistan, you're giving it to the Taliban. You're actually making the problem worse. So like, talk about throwing away money. So like, how are you getting that money to the people that you think you're going to try and affect? And so I just don't understand it. I keep looking at it and I have all these questions and I just don't get it.
Yeah. I mean, it's not new that we're funding. So one of the things, so aggravating. One of the things I say, you mentioned counterinsurgency earlier. Part of the problem when we fight counterinsurgency is that we were the insurgents. We toppled the government and tried to start a new one. That's an insurgency. And then we managed to fight ourselves and undermine our own success by literally funding the Taliban in any number of ways. So we had all of these problems where our doctrine, our tactics, our theory, none of it made any goddamn sense. And then hardly anyone was good at the job because, like you said, an infantry battalion is supposed to go out and tear apart other infantry battalions. Yeah, that's what you guys practice on. But the reality is look, as a guy, as a spy, my job is to go out and engage people. And there is not a professional school for me to go be a certified professional KLE engager. Now, any LT, any colonel, anybody can go out and go engage any governmental official and has literally you couldn't do that with a saw. You could, like, if you had a battalion full of guys and a guy's like, I want to fire the saw, like, well, you better go get qualified on it because you're not going to carry it otherwise. But if you can go talk to anybody you want, any damn buddy. That makes no sense, Stu.
Yeah. I don't know what to say, but you're right. We all did go to the KLEs, the Shuras, whatever you want to call them, and served in a diplomatic role just because the Department of State didn't have the ability to do it.
Where does the accountability stop? I mean, look, again, I like Dan Crenshaw. I think he's a good dude. I love the fact that he's a SEAL and a badass and that he's serving in Congress. But the thing I know about congressional members is they love the camera and they love getting reelected. And I see Dan Crenshaw complaining about Afghans getting out of Afghanistan because we botched the withdrawal. And I know personally that people go and they meet with him trying to get Afghans out. He can't write any legislation. So, I don't mind in this case pointing a finger at anybody in Congress who says that they want to help Afghanistan or get Americans out or wherever, and they can't manage to do it. Where does the blame stop in this thing?
I've been disappointed with Congress bipartisan holistically because when I was in jail, the generals, General McKenzie, the Secretary of Defense, General Milley, all testified to the House and the Senate, and bipartisan, they were all angry and talked about how botched the withdrawal was. But then after it, like you said, nothing happened. They're not doing anything. They didn't hold anybody accountable. And in my opinion, the one way that Congress holds the DOD accountable is the budget. And they're just all too afraid to stand against the budget because of all the things going on, Taiwan, Ukraine. To stand against the budget could potentially put service members' lives at risk and goes against self-preservation in terms of if their goal is to remain in office. But quite honestly, I think Congress needs to use the budget as a lever of control to say, show me metrics of effectiveness, show me who's accountable for the last failures, because otherwise they've demonstrated that they have no ability to provide checks and balances for the military.
There's a lot to say about that. There's a lot to say about that. We're rubbing our chin looking at standing on the brink of another conflict. What a surprise that Joe Biden and his dummies are thinking about going into Ukraine. Whether or not we should go, different story. I'm saying we can't go because we don't ever get this stuff right. We don't ever get it right. Those guys haven't deserved or earned the right to get to try again, because I have no confidence in the bottom line of your resignation letter. I have no confidence in your ability to leave. I have no confidence in the secretary. If you think that COVID is the number one thing we're trying to fight, goodness gracious, what are we doing here? If global warming is the number one thing, then our problems are solved. Let's go worry about that, not even have a military. I know you have things to say about that. And again, I'm trying to stay in control, but it is so aggravating. This, like, we just left that part of the world. Afghanistan and Ukraine are just not that far apart. And now we're desperate to go back with 5,000 new people, which equals 25,000 people. And it just goes on and on and on.
I think this is a tougher conversation, but no one wants to talk about the utility of NATO. There needs to be a tough conversation about the utility of NATO. NATO was created post-World War II to stabilize that region, and it long ago has served its purpose. So, like, what is it accomplishing now? And I have good friends in the Department of State. I went to one of them. I went to command and staff with a girl in the Department of State, and then she's a Russian DOS representative, speaks fluent Russian, and is very passionate about the utility of NATO. And it would be a great episode to just have me and her point counterpoint. But my opinion is, if you read the Russian national security strategy, their biggest threat is NATO. And so everything that they do, destabilizing Georgia or Ukraine, has to do with stopping their influence in NATO and becoming partnered members. So, is NATO making it worse, or is NATO making it better? Yes. You got to really take a hard look at that. And even if you subscribe to NATO as deterring aggression, then my other follow-up point would be, but aren't we weakening our European allies by continuing to be the force that's there doing the things that really Europe should be doing? So, if I was in a position of influence like the Department of Defense or the president, I would really take a hard look at the utility of NATO, because we're spending billions of dollars on European defense. And quite honestly, I again, like, operational and strategical, like, what is the impact we're trying to have? And if it's just to stop Russian influence, which is really the stated goal of NATO, I think it's also, Russia doesn't have the ability to project military power like the United States. So if you look at all their military power, it's on the border regions where they use now a lot of gray and soft power to destabilize, and then use the military as a final threat to do what needs to be done. But I think it's antiquated thinking. Vladimir Putin thinks that grabbing up those border regions, go back to the old USSR, is power. But quite honestly, in modern day, I don't know if more land equals more power. And I think by acquiring more land, he might actually be creating more problems than he is actually solving. And so in just a lot of ways, I'm not sure a military solution from America and Ukraine is the answer, but it's definitely complicated.
It's definitely complicated, and it gets more complicated as soon as you start to bring in Turkey and the Bosphorus and oil and all these other things that make it complicated. China's complicated too. Their middle class is exploding and is larger than the entire population of the U.S. We don't want China to fail, because that is a horrible thing for humanity and just for stability in general. So how do you allow China to strategically stabilize itself without allowing China to run over the top of everybody? That's not I don't know what the answer is to that, Stu. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Obviously, the population of China is a strength for them, and their exports is a strength for them. But again, they don't have military power they can project in the sense that we do. And so sometimes I think people overplay their strengths. So if you look at all their military might, it's in the border regions, it's in the South China Sea. They do have some buildup in Africa and other places, but they're not in all the places of the world in terms of military might in the sense of America. And so, it's also a complicated, that's why places like the Philippines and Vietnam are so critically important right there on the edges of China and how we develop relationships with them. But I also think there's some antiquated military thinking in terms of, if you're going to go to war with China, you're just going to go through these weapons engagement rings and you're going to decentralize, and that's how you're going to win it. Like, if you go to war with China, you're going to take out oil refineries in Africa. You're going to take out satellites in space. Like, that's where the war starts. It doesn't start in this old school World War II crossing weapons engagement zone rings. But I also agree that, the best sense would be some type of cohabitation, but I don't know if China sees the world in the same sense that we do. And there's a lot of evidence to say that China is not going to ever become like us. And so I agree with President Trump when he said we were competing with China, and we absolutely are competing with China, but we just got to be very careful about how we navigate what we've been doing.
And this goes back to the whole lack of confidence thing. I just don't think people like Milken and Miley and Austin are up to the task. I don't know who is. I don't know if there's a Forrester out there. I'd be like, that's the guy, because it is more job than one person or one table full of people can really handle. So are we being unfair and holding these guys accountable if the guys behind them are and not in any better shape?
I think there are guys behind them that are in better shape. And I think a lot of those guys get weeded out because they don't subscribe to the political nature of the promotion system. So I've been saying in a couple interviews how I can give you literally names from 1-star to lieutenant colonel that I think would be better prepared to lead some of these wars. If you look at Eisenhower was brought up as a 1-star, as kind of a protege under different people. And ultimately his quick ascension is what allowed us to win World War II in a lot of ways. So I think we need to get back to identifying talent and not necessarily a time-based system. And I do think that there are people in there that would do better than the people that have navigated the system at the top now.
When you were going through the thick of it, and you were either in the brig or close to it, and you were predicting the future because you know how the machine works and everything, some of your peers, and I guess you might call them friends at some point, absolutely turned coat on you. If you're a commander, look, if my Marine below did that, I'd have a real problem with it. I understand that we need to gather evidence, but by the way, you're not the cops. You're an officer. You still have this integrity thing, and you've just violated it. This guy's your friend? I don't know, man. And I know the world doesn't always work like that, but I'd have a real problem advancing the career or giving a good fit report of somebody who did that.
I think the problem is the generals that were overseeing my case thought the same way as them. And that's a lot of the problem with the system. The system promotes people that think like their bosses because their bosses give a subjective evaluation. So that is what it is. I think those people that spoke badly about me knew that their bosses thought the same way. And so they were, again, giving their bosses what they wanted. They knew that they didn't have a boss that was being objective and looking at the whole picture. And so therefore that's what it was.
Shout out to my buddy Mark Azevedo, who kicked in $10 and thanked you for your courage. And man, for sure. I mean, one of the things is we talk, we talk in theory about, is this the hill you want to die on? And you said, yep.
I literally said that. I had friends texting me saying, you need to take it down, talking about some of my videos. Yeah. And I said, this is the hill I'm going to die on. I'm prepared for it.
This is the Man of Destiny stuff. You knew it was, I don't want to say you knew it was a contentious decision that was going to cause you trouble. Maybe you didn't realize it would cost you your marriage or whatever it is, but you knew this was not going to be an easy road. And you waited. You're not a dumb guy. Matter of fact, you're a brilliant guy. You are a fantastic officer by everything everybody says about you. And you said, nope, I've taken all I can stand. I can't stand no more. And this is where it's going to end. And you didn't back down from it. And then your friends are like, take the video down. No, I've made this decision. Everything after this is that. You took your dice and you threw them across the Rubicon and said, this is, well, you didn't do, that's probably a terrible example, but let's say this clearly. Someone might cut that up. I just want to say clearly, Stu is not in any way proposing to go and overthrow the government. Stop with all that stuff. And Stu is not crazy. I mean, this is not an insane person. We're all trying to understand you. But the thing to understand is you made this decision. You said, nope, this will not stand.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, that was easy. All right. So
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is you're right. I mean, exactly what you just said. I didn't fully appreciate everything that I would go through. I knew it would be a difficult road, but it was one of those things where once you jump into it, you're almost at more risk submitting and trying to run back. And I knew the only way out was all the way through. I believed in what I said, and I wasn't going to back down. And it's kind of surprising in a lot of ways because the Marine Corps spent 17 years making me a warrior. So for them to think that I would just stop fighting was actually kind of surprising to me, especially when I felt like I was coming from a place of value and something that I believed in, that they just thought that they could intimidate me, and I wasn't going to back down.
This is my favorite Dan Rather question. He asked it of Kenny Rogers. So I'm going to ask you. It's real simple. Regrets.
Regret is a complicated word. There's always things you would do differently, but ultimately on the macro level, I would go back and do it again. And even the things that I would tweak, I'm not even sure if that would be the right. It's like the butterfly effect. If you take the bad out, I don't know if all the good would have came with it too. So the path that I was on went the way it went. And if I truly believe I'm going to end up on top. I truly believe I'm going to make a difference. I don't know, people may still be calling me crazy because a lot of people think you can't make change, but I don't regret what I did.
Fair enough. And that's a good answer. It's a fair answer. If I was your 06 mentor and I'm looking at you and you're like, hey, Pete, this is what I'm thinking about doing. What do you think? I would encourage you to do it, but I know a lot of your peers, and Scott Husing is a good friend of mine. You actually were Scott Husing's point of contact at one point for something that you guys were doing together. Yeah. Why not do it within the system? I mean,
yeah, that's a fair question. And a lot of people brought that up in the beginning. I could give countless examples going through my own situation after the fact where I tried to go through the system and like illegally prevented from doing so. I knew when I posted that first video that going through the system wouldn't work in the same manner that I knew the senior leaders weren't going to be held accountable as I watched what unfolded. I just had been doing this long enough that I made certain assumptions and calculations based on my experiences in education. And I knew that, one, trying to address it through the system wouldn't have any impact. And I knew, two, that if I just stayed quiet and tried to navigate through the system to get to a place where I could eventually make influence, that I would end up either not in the place where I was seeking, or I would end up like the people that are at the top now that have demonstrated through action that they don't have the ability to make the changes that are required. So I went the route that I went.
I want to echo that from a completely tangential point, but this is 100% true because it happened to me in Bosnia. I was getting no paid dues right after deploying, and I lived on the economy, so I had my own apartment. And I all of a sudden wasn't able to pay my bill. And so I was having to get on the phone and call back to Germany. Luckily, my landlord was a German who worked at a U.S. installation, so I could literally DSN call him. But someone decided for some reason or pushed a button or whatever that I was a divorced female Mexican lady. And that screwed my pay all up. I don't know what happened. Certainly wasn't anything I did because I was getting paid until I deployed. And so I'm like, and my commander, a guy named Paul Norwood, F that guy, wouldn't let me go back and straighten it out, made me do it over DSN, offered me no help. And so here I am in E4 trying to navigate this impossible thing. And I said, like, this is stupid. Like, how can I had to prove I wasn't divorced, Stu. I wasn't even married. It's like I'd never been married. And so I filed an IG complaint because that's what you do. Like, hey, this shouldn't happen to people. What the hell happened? And I swear to God, this is true. The report came back and said, we found that you were a Mexican divorce lady. That was literally the finding, was that there was nothing wrong, that it wasn't a mistake. And that can happen. And so when you go to the very institution that's supposed to support service members, when there's I see something wrong, well, I'm not going to throw my career away and go down that path. And I know you must have stories like that where you're like, yeah, they tried going through the IG and literally nothing happened.
Yeah, I've got countless stories like that. And quite honestly, since I've done this, you would be amazed at how many people have reached out. And it's actually been heartbreaking, some of the stories of exactly that. People trying to go through the system and just getting wronged. I think the military justice system is fundamentally flawed. I think my investigation is a perfect example of how the process is broken in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I think now, does that mean what I did was right? I mean, I don't know. That's a tough question. I broke the rules. I acknowledge it. I accepted accountability for it, but I don't apologize. I don't regret it. And ultimately, I thought the conversation and the impact that I can have outweighed the rules that I broke.
I mean, you pled guilty to the things that you were guilty of. And there's things that when you're given your charges, like Article 92 is on every single one, officer, actions of becoming officer, that's always one. And you have to stand there and say, yes, they can always get you on those smaller things. But that just, again, that goes right back to your character and your man of destiny. You can't shirk your destiny. This was it. So what if you could change one thing right now and make one more positive impact? If you could have one thing change, would it be McKinsey dropping his resignation? What would it be? What would you want?
If I could have one thing right now, it'd be McKinsey being fired, or at a bare minimum, raising his hand and saying, I should be held accountable because this was not executed well. But so that's one part of it. The other part, what I want is in the 22 election cycle, I want to get some candidates that I built in my coalition elected so that we have some people with leadership qualities to do some of the things that I've been talking about, I think need to occur with Congress.
Yeah, we've got to get better people in Congress. We just have to. I know you're taking a knee. That's your quote in terms of this election cycle, next election cycle. But please, if you are standing in front of whoever it is and they're testifying to Congress, please just don't have the camera go on you and make your points. It's embarrassing to see that happen and to know that, look, this is bipartisan. Lindsey Graham can go F himself because he doesn't do anything. He talks to whoever it is, makes a big show, and then literally probably goes out to dinner with the dude afterwards. I mean, that's what I'm left to think, right? We've got to get better people that have character, that will go out and do things. And then the other thing is and I'm a firm believer in this, so I'm just going to plant this in your brain. I'm not so worried about term limits because that's our responsibility as voters. But I think if you reach a certain point of wealth, let's call it $50 million while you're in Congress, hey, you won. You don't need to serve anybody anymore. Go home, because you can't relate to someone who's trying to get to living to check. You have $50 million in your assets, and your stock predictions are bordering on prescient. Good job. Way to go. Get the hell out of Congress. You've been retired. Congratulations. Let's go get somebody else in there. That's something I would like to see, is just a financial limit, because I just can't imagine that these folks that get wealthy in Congress, I can't imagine that they have anybody else's best interest in heart before their own.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I've been thinking about this a lot. I think in all systems, you're right. The top and the bottom probably don't make rules or advocate for things in the best interest of the system. So I think it comes from the people in the middle that have enough experience understanding the system. And so in the government, to me, that's the people that make 80 to 150,000, right? Those people probably understand what needs to happen best. All the people that are coming out of college that are demanding their college debt be wiped are young, have no experience, and are trying to change the rules of the system to benefit them, which isn't necessarily in the best interest of the system. All the people that have, like you said, $50 million have so much wealth, they've probably lost contact with those making 80 to 150 and probably aren't making decisions in the best interest of the system. And so I think it's the same with the military. There was a lot of talk about why all these lieutenant colonels were speaking out. You brought up, Ho earlier. There's Lohmeyer. You go down the list. And some people were likening it to a midlife crisis, but I think it's the same anomaly. At the lieutenant colonel 17, 18-year mark, you have enough experience to understand everything in the system. You're not trying to change the rules because you're already there close to retirement, but you're not this 4-star general that's protecting power. So like 4-star general being that $50 million, that Lance Corporal being that college graduate that wants to change all the rules to increase his power much faster. And so I think the best perspective of the system comes from that middle rank. And so agree with you wholeheartedly.
one of the things I want to close out on here, and then I'll give you the mic to talk about whatever you want to talk about, but the perception that you were somehow crazy or anything else, I actually have seen crazy. Look, if you've deployed for any length of time, you've seen someone have their weapon removed and be either sent home or looked after. And we had a female that was, I was worried about her overall stability and her being possibly suicidal. Like, you'd watch her face would change like a cartoon character with emotions. She had no control over them. And so I said at one point, like, hey, and this was not just like the first time, this was leading up or trying to like let her self-correct, and she wasn't able to do it. And, you know, it's stressful what we were doing. We were going off the camp all the time. And I said, hey, I'm worried that you're going to hurt yourself. And she looks at me straight in the eye. And this is a woman that's armed, everybody. Okay. And she says, I'm not the suicidal type. I'm the homicidal type. And she wasn't crazy. She stayed. They let her have a weapon. How in the world could you be crazy if you didn't say anything as insane as that? By the way, that's right around the time when that one dude left the camp and went village to village and started assassinating people, right? This is the same time frame, same basic region of the country. And no one thought, let's get in front of this one because she wasn't crazy. And somehow they tried to make you out to be. What are your thoughts?
That was a very frustrating process. I can't tell you how hard it is to have your mental health attacked and at the same time be told you can't speak freely. So, you know, I literally had people, I was reading comments in news articles that were calling me schizophrenic. I had other military officers saying he's bipolar. I had the Marine Corps saying that it was PTSD. And I knew in my heart of hearts that it was none of that I was just making a principled stance, but it was almost easier for them to credit me as crazy because to admit that I was just doing something principled would be an indictment on their own shortcomings for not having done it. And so it was one of those things where it was very frustrating, but you know, again, I knew how strong I was. I knew what my beliefs were, and I wasn't going to be deterred. I wasn't going to let them influencing me with them projecting what they thought I was. And I think at the end of the day, specifically with all the interviews I've been able to do since I've gotten out, it's been good for people to kind of come to that conclusion because, I mean, just talk to me and you'll know pretty quickly that there's a lot to me under the surface. And what I'm saying makes a lot of sense.
I've been kicked off a lot of camps because I similarly to you, like, this isn't working. And I don't have a problem saying that. Part of my job as a spy is to figure out, you know, those 4 line items that every commander has: close with and destroy, protect the force, enable the enablers, and teach and train. Those are the 4 basic things everybody's trying to do over there. My job is to figure out answers to all of those things. How do we help enable the commander to do that? And when I find fellow counterintelligence agents that are recommending for termination, every interpreter they meet, so this is in Eastern Afghanistan, because these interpreters are tied to the Taliban, I lose my mind. Yeah. Like, how in the world, 1, are we supposed to talk? 2, we don't have a school for talking to people anyhow. And 3, you dullards, by the way, I'm a counterintelligence agent, haven't realized that the Taliban is the norm. And do your effing job. Turn these guys, turn them into sources. It is everywhere. And I'm so glad you did this. I'm so glad you stood up. Because, look, you get kicked off a camp, you go home, you get a different job, you come back, and you do it again because we're desperate to do the right thing. But what we're not doing right now is the right thing. I know you've talked a lot on other shows and everything else. I just want to let you close with whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to mention. Everybody should go to the links that I'm posting. Head to votesforvets.org. That's Stu's new organization. And then you can always go to his website, AuthenticAmericans.com. Open mic to you, and then we'll close it from there.
Thanks, Pete. I'll end with this. This whole situation, I've had a lot of questions. I've had a lot of things projected on me. But the one question that's really kind of bothered me is that most people came at me with, you're not going to make a difference, Stu. This is the way it is, and you can't change it. And I just fundamentally, philosophically disagree with that. I truly believe we can make a change. And if you agree with the content of my statements, I would submit that now is the time for action. Now is the time to make a difference, because continuing to kick this can down the road could have catastrophic results. I think America is at an inflection point, and I think now is the time to make the changes that are desperately needed.
All right, stand by.